So, you know, in those nature shows where like the mama bird favors one of the chicks and the other baby bird is sort of left to wither away? Well, that's sort of what happened to King Seiko back in the 70s. But you know what? The king's back, baby. Hey guys, I'm Max and this is Watch Crunch. So do you get annoyed sometimes at the lack of real watch discussions on Instagram? Or maybe you get irritated at clunky, hard to use watch forums? Well, you should come join us on watchcrunch.com. This is a modern platform that we built from the ground up for talking watches. So the new King Seiko versus my Grand Seiko. We're going to compare these two watches in 5 different ways: the history, design, wearability, of movement, and finally the price tier that they sit in. So you might have heard of the romantic story of how little old Seiko took on the Swiss in the 60s at the observatory timing trials high up in the Alps. And to do this, Seiko supposedly split up their factories and pitted them against each other, with Suwa Seikosha based in the countryside making Grand Seiko and Daini Seikosha based in Tokyo producing King Seiko. There was some truth to this, and it is true that over the course of about 5 years starting in the early 60s, Seiko made a lot of headway in these timing trials, such that they went from 144th in the first year to, in 1968, first place, leading the Swiss to then cancel the whole thing the next year. The reality was a bit more complex, as Seiko had always positioned King Seiko below its flagship Grand Seiko, and both Suwa and Daini factories produce parts for both watch lines. But regardless, ultimately it was Grand Seiko that carried the torch in the late 80s as Seiko pushed back into the luxury market, with King Seiko allowed to sort of languish away, making its last watch in 1975. But in this day and age, as Grand Seiko continues to push up market, it's vacated a space below it, a great opportunity for Seiko to bring back its long-lost brother in King Seiko. So the King Seiko SPB279 is one of 5 distinct dial colors offered in this new release, and it's probably the most historically accurate version to the 1960s 44KS with a silver sunburst dial. And that dial is really pleasingly done with radial brushing that scatters the light as you look at it from different angles. The word King Seiko, written in stylized font, just like the old watch, sits at the 6 o'clock position, but there is this uninspired automatic text underneath it that I think is just unnecessary. Now, true to its dressy nature, the dial is simple with rectangular hour markers, the most striking of which sits at the 12 o'clock with a double baton sporting an intricate surface crosshatch pattern. There's no date to disturb the symmetry, no loom to complicate things, just precisely cut edges and finely polished surfaces to play with the light. Actually, design-wise, I think in general, I found the new King Seiko lacking some of the elegance of the original. The 44KS, despite being the same physical size, had an expansive looking dial with thin bezels and smaller dial elements. In comparison, the Revival loses some of these proportions with a meatier bezel and also more distortion along the rounded edge of the box sapphire, possibly due to the way that it was milled. Now compare that with this Grand Seiko SBGA415. The dial on this watch is said to resemble rolling clouds in the wintertime, and it really does, with overlapping shapes full of microscopic texture and depth. The hands are actually a much better match to the original 44KS than the King Seiko itself, precisely cut and beveled. The case is titanium, notoriously a hard metal to work with, but still finished to a higher degree than the King Seiko. And finally, the sapphire crystal is milled thinner and thus has less distortion and taking up less visual space from the dial. Now this is where the King Seiko pulls back some points in terms of its size. It's about a whole size smaller than the Grand Seiko at just 37 millimeters wide, which is about perfect on my 6.5-inch wrist. The original grammar of design for King Seiko gives this case its iconic shape, which emphasizes flat, polished surfaces that reflect the light. So look at these lugs. They're chunky, geometric, with large, highly polished bevels. This, along with a flat end link sandwiched in between, extends the case presence, giving it a longish 44 millimeters lug to lug, and on the wrist, a rectangular feel. The Grand Seiko, on the other hand, being 40 millimeters, is a bit large on my wrist, but this is helped by having less dramatic lugs. Both watches lose points though on their bracelets, as neither has any micro adjustments, making a precise fit difficult. This results in the Grand Seiko feeling a tad loose on my wrist and the King Seiko just a tad tight. With that said, the King Seiko bracelet is well refined and definitely a notch above what you would get out of a Prospex or Presage watch, with angular links that are brushed on the top surface and polished in between them. The bracelet feels supple and has a gentle taper that ends at a signed butterfly clasp. Now, when it comes to movements, we have to start with the Grand Seiko because the 9R65 spring drive inside is out of this world. So 3 decades of research yielded a movement that generates a completely smooth sweep. Not because it's beating fast, but because it doesn't beat at all. No, it doesn't use a battery and it still draws energy from a mainspring that runs through a mechanical gear train, but like an overbearing mother hovering over a clumsy child, a quartz-driven system regulates the mechanical parts and puts a brake on it until it's within plus or minus 1 second per day. Now, all of this tedious work and it's still able to squeeze out 3 days of power reserve. I just feel like every time I review the specs of this thing, it blows my mind all over again. Then we come to the King Seiko. Okay, so if you're still here, go ahead, put on your flame suits with me because the next part is gonna get a little unpleasant. So the 6R31, the heart of the new King Seiko, at the risk of sounding hyperbolic, is an insult to the King Seiko name. A name built on producing chronometer-grade movements. Remember those Swiss observatories? It's got an error rate of -15 to plus 25 seconds a day. And doing a bit more research, I learned that the 6R is nothing but a derivative of the 7S26. Yeah, remember those movements found in $50 Seiko 5s just a couple years ago? Sure, they've improved it with hacking, hand winding, and double the power reserve to about 70 hours, but there's only so much lipstick you can put on a pig. In the end, it beats at a slow 21.6, hardly a display of fine watchmaking, considering King Seiko was building 36.6 high beat movements back in the 60s. Okay, so I've been a bit harsh. This is actually a lovely watch, and I think appropriately priced at $1,700. Now, of course, it's unfair to compare that with a $6,000 Grand Seiko. So the King Seiko has a lot going for it, from its sweet proportions to its beautiful dial and a supple, surprisingly good bracelet. But I'm only harsh about this watch because I really wanted it to succeed. King Seiko collectors are a passionate bunch, and when you bring back such a legend, you hate for it to land with such a thud. In the end, this feels like a watch made by accountants to fill a price tier rather than craftsmen putting their best foot forward. You know what this feels like? This feels like back in the late 80s when they first unveiled the Honda NSX concept and they had stuck a 4-cylinder Accord engine under the hood. Yeah. That was very quickly and angrily corrected by the CEO of Honda. And I hope that Seiko also corrects the movement in the next King Seiko, because you know what? This name deserves it. But what do you think? Do you care that King Seiko has a base movement inside? So I actually borrowed this watch from a prominent member of Watch Crunch. His name is Omega Nut. and he's really funny, and he told me the only thing he asked in return is that in this video, we include a wrist shot with his dog in the background. So here it is, Buster. All right, guys, stay crunchy, and I'll see you in the next one.